Forgotten Christmas, 1950, by Doug Whitley. Mark's feet felt like blocks of ice. Where his toes were, there was only the burning pain of cold. His gloved hands wrapped numbly around his M1, and he wasn't sure he could feel the trigger to pull it if the entire PVA, People's Volunteer Army, came over the rise into the Chosin Reservoir, the frozen Chosin, where he stood. He smiled at that. Frozen Chosin. That was what his friends at school called the Presbyterians. Even his hometown of Toledo at its coldest couldn't compare to the 33 below that froze everything in sight around him. This huge reservoir was completely frozen over. He was standing on 3 feet of water. His time on Parris Island in South Carolina had done nothing to prepare him for this. They should have trained in Alaska, or Siberia, or a frozen meat locker. He shook himself, readjusted the marine issue woolen scarf that covered his nose and mouth, resettled his helmet and liner with his gloved hand, wiped the frost from his glasses, and continued staring at the icebound wasteland around him. He stamped his feet, hoping silently they wouldn't shatter. What were they doing here anyway? The war was almost over. Sorry, this police action, which everyone knew was a war, but no one wanted to say. The North Koreans had been pushed to the Chinese border since their attack in June. This was a mopping-up operation. General MacArthur's "Home by Christmas" was on everyone's lips. That brought a smile to his face. He was ready to go. His only regret was that he hadn't been able to find Sang-hee, or anyone else he had known since a child in Korea. Home by Christmas. He could still taste the Thanksgiving dinner. That was 3 days ago. The hot food a pleasant memory in the bitter cold. "Kill Marine! Kill Yankee!" The cry shattered the still hours of early dawn around him. Someone fired a flare, and before him, where there had been only windswept trees, a frozen lake, and low vegetation, there was a sea of Chinese faces with Russian weapons, all pointed at him. They came in swarms by the hundreds, by the thousands. All around him firing began, the hollow echo of the M1, the low chatter of the Thompson, the growl of the BAR, the extended stutter of the 50 caliber machine guns. He unslung his rifle and began to fire blindly from the hip. He didn't need to aim. With so many in front of him, he was bound to hit something, someone. He saw dozens fall and more dozens as he emptied clip after clip, and still they kept coming. His unit was about to be flanked if they didn't fall back. The order came, and everyone around him fired and turned, fired and turned, fired and turned, but the hordes of Chinese just kept coming like an avalanche of humanity. The chaos of battle slowed time and blurred distance. The cold was literally mind-numbing. For the next 3 days he knew only firing, digging in on the frozen ground, sleeping in snatches, waking and pressing on, as the vanguard of the People's Volunteer Army maintained its relentless onslaught. The UN forces realized the only hope was to fight their way to Hagaru-ri and Koto-ri, join up with the units there. Like this, isolated, surrounded, they wouldn't last a week. The constant roar of Marine jets, bombers, dropping napalm on the Chinese, the only warmth they could feel. The whir of choppers bringing in supplies, taking out the wounded, and there were wounded, so many wounded, surrounded him. The Marines were surrounded, cut off from the other units. Slowly, inexorably, they were fighting their way south to the only road leading to the shore. The Army was south. The Navy was south. The other Marine detachments were south. Safety was south, and in his frozen mind he thought Home by Christmas had just gone south as well. Sang-hee put one swollen foot in front of the other. She must keep going. For her sake, for the sake of the child she carried inside her, she must keep moving. If she could get to the Americans, she would be safe. She hoped she would be safe. But it was so far. And she was so cold. She was heading east toward the Sea of Japan. She could not let the communists catch her. That would mean death, as it had meant for her husband in June when the army attacked. She had fled their beautiful home. It had been in her husband's family since the 1800s. The courtyard was filled with cherry blossoms. It had protected her husband's family for generations. The house had a curved vaulted roof covered with dark tile. Rich wood made up the gates, the doors, and the rafters. It was a place of beauty and tranquility. until the communists had come to take her husband to his death. It could protect them no more. It was summer. The weather was warm. She was just beginning to show. Her husband was so proud of their coming child. And now he was gone. Executed because he dared to oppose the communists. Gone because he fought against them. She gathered her padded jacket closer about her and kept walking. Memories of her home, her family, her friends keeping her company as she trudged on. She made her way from village to village, always finding some distant friend or relative to help her. She would sleep on a pallet on the floor. They would give her food along the way. But now, as she drew closer to the coast, she could hear the distant bombing of what she hoped were American planes. She dared not think they were Russian or Chinese, for then all would be lost and her Korea would be swept into the sea. The landscape was bleak, frozen as far as her eyes could see. The weak winter sun brought her no warmth, only the sign that she was headed east. The baby stirred within her. She patted her swollen belly and cooed to her coming child that all would be well. Would that it was as easily said as done. That phrase, easier said than done, jolted her memory. The Grauman's, father, mother, daughter, son, came into her mind as clearly as the day they'd met. The missionaries from America that had come to her village to share the gospel. They had been so kind, so loving, so cautious not to offend. They didn't know that going to the Presbyterian church was an act of defiance and rebellion against the Japanese oppressors. They had no idea the Koreans who sat in their tiny hall each Sunday saw the missionaries not as invaders but as leaders of a resistance movement designed to overthrow the worship forced upon them by the Japanese overlords, and so the church grew. All over Korea the church grew, and most of the missionaries had no idea. Even in her misery, she smiled at the thought of the Grauman's as subversives. They dressed in traditional costume. They spoke only Korean if Koreans were present. They ate kimchi, as all Koreans. And they loved us, she thought. They had come to Korea in 1929, when the world was falling apart. They shared what little they had with those who gathered in their church. Saying he smiled again as she thought of growing up with Alice and Mark. The thought of Mark broke her reverie. Where is he now, her first love? He had been 12 and she was 11. Her first love before the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Her first love before arranged marriages and social position. Her first love. They went everywhere together. School, church, walking in the woods. Is he here with the UN forces? Was he in America studying at a Presbyterian seminary or someplace? Was he lying on a battlefield, a frozen corpse like so many others? What had become of her first love? The World War had kept them apart. She'd spent the war as a young teen hiding from the Japanese, who took Korean women to service their brothels, their comfort houses, they called them. Mark felt like an automaton, one of the robots he'd seen in Popular Mechanics in the waiting room at his dentist back in Toledo. Eat a cold meal. It didn't matter if it was hot when he got it. In the time it took to sit and eat, at 35 below, it was nearly frozen. Grab a few minutes of sleep, get more ammo, rotate to the firing line, pull the trigger. Thinking wasn't necessary. It had been like that for weeks now. He had no idea how the battle was going. He knew they were moving glacially down the valley to the coast. They had joined the units south of them. He knew that without the Marine Air Corps they would be dead, overrun. He knew it was December, but he had no idea what day it was or the date. Pull the trigger, reload. He let his eyes wander briefly to the 2 mountain peaks that commanded control of the single-lane road that led from the reservoir to the sea. He knew that even as he heard his fellow Marines call this Hellfire Valley, that up there it must be hell itself. Here there was marginal hope. Up there was no hope at all. Pull the trigger, reload. Had he climbed those mountains a lifetime ago? The memory crept back unbidden. It was the spring of 1941. His family was doing one of the few things open to anyone then. They were hiking. It was cheap. It didn't require precious gasoline. It was far from the Japanese occupiers. Sang He had been with them. They were nearing the crest and had stopped to enjoy the view of the valley covered in the spring blossoms. He felt a nudge at his shoulder, and there was Sang He holding a bottle of water out to him, and his heart turned over. He was in love. He pressed the bottle to his lips, thinking that her lips had been the last to touch the glass. For the rest of the hike, he stayed by her side. Mark was pretty sure his mother noticed, because he caught her smiling secretly several times. Of course, he was smiling himself, too, and so was Sang He. From then on, the two of them were inseparable until December 7th, 1941. That changed everything. Mark and his family were able to escape back to the United States. The Korean missionaries spent the war years, like everyone else, doing what they could for the war effort. They ministered to the small contingent of Koreans in their city. They saved paper and food and metal, and Mark grew older, but he never forgot Sang He. Mark came out of his reverie with a start. He was so cold and so thirsty. The cold that stole your energy also took the very moisture from your body. The air vibrated with the bombardment of the Marine jets and the roar of their engines. The noise of machine guns, the battle cries of the Chinese soldiers, their blaring bugles, clanging gongs. They beat night and day. The very sound of the bullets burning past his ears of the fractions of seconds that determined life or death, the moans of the wounded around him, all this surrounded him in a maelstrom of sound that was in itself disorienting. Would he ever know silence again? The frozen ground shook with the bombing. The cold seeped into his bones. Fire, reload, pull the trigger, over and over again until time and distance had lost all meaning, until life itself had lost all meaning. There was a flash, and a man with a camera smiled and said, "Hey, now you'll be in Life magazine." There was a pause, and then the stranger asked him a question, as if all this was completely normal. "Hey, son, what do you want for Christmas?" Mark had mumbled, "Give me another tomorrow." The man's smile left him, and he moved on to the next story. The 1st Marines, the British Commandos, the other UN units caught up in the retreat, continued to battle toward the coast. Inch by inch, mile by mile, they fought their way, continually surrounded by the Chinese. The ground was dearly bought by those units on the high ground that would never see the shore or even Christmas. Because of them, because of their sacrifice, the main body could not be overrun. Mark had no idea where they were, no idea what day it was, no idea how long this had been going on or how long it would continue until they reached their goal or a Chinese bullet found its mark. He smiled at the double meaning in a weary way. "Found its mark," he whispered to himself. Sang He awoke in darkness. The evening before, she had maneuvered her ungainly body into a small opening at the foot of the steep hillside that formed the valley she'd been following. The opening became a cave where a small rivulet of fresh water ran from the heart of the mountain to the tributary that flowed through the valley to the river that led to the sea. A few feet in, the moist, earthy warmth of the cave enveloped her. For the first time in days, she began to be warm. She knew it wasn't really, truly warm, but compared to the sub-zero temperatures outside, it was almost balmy. Her eyes began to adjust to the murk from the opening, and she found a dry place among the rocks to lean back. She was soon asleep, her pregnant belly cradled in the stone. Sometime later, she opened her eyes. The darkness was complete now. She had no idea of the time, but she was hungry. She felt her way to the spring she could hear gently bubbling in the darkness and brought a few handfuls of water to her lips. She clambered back into her nest and slipped into another fitful slumber. She woke again from the nightmare of a Chinese soldier bayoneting her in the back, only to find that it was a sharp rock and the cave floor pressing into her spine. Her stiff joints were slow to respond. But for all that, she felt rested. A dull glow from the cave's mouth told her it was day. Should she wait until nightfall or try to make her way through the valley in daylight, risking Chinese patrols? Her pregnancy decided her. She was relatively warm, safe, dry for the moment. She would make what meal she could from her small provisions. drink more water, and tried to rest through the day. One thing she could always do in her pregnancy is sleep. She would move again at dark. Sang-hee closed her eyes and slipped into a fitful slumber. By now, General O.P. Smith's words to the press had spread throughout the embattled Marines. "We're not retreating, we're attacking in a different direction." Truly, it was an organized movement. However it was phrased, the situation was dire. The UN forces were outnumbered 10-1. No matter how many Chinese had been killed, there always seemed to be more. Mark wiped his gloved hand over his face and continued to do what Marines had trained him to do. But in the small lulls that had come even in the fiercest combat, his mind turned again to Sang-hee. Where was she? What was she doing? Had she survived World War II? Had she survived this war? Was she married? Did she remember him? Would he be able to find her in all of this chaos? His heart, his faith, told him God was in control, but his mind had lost all hope. Over and over he had quoted Psalm 23, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." Those words and Paul's admonition to Timothy, "God has not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind," were constantly on his lips. But he was afraid. Afraid like the men around him, also fighting for their lives. And then a searing pain went through his head, and blackness enveloped him. "He's had it," were the first words Mark heard when he came to. "No, I haven't," he answered in his mind, but nothing moved. Not his eyes, not his lips, not anything. He felt rough hands lift him up and move him to a stretcher. Maybe now he would be flown to safety in the chopper like so many others he had seen, if he could only tell them he was alive, but he couldn't. He knew he would be stacked like cordwood with the other dead bodies, to be buried in the shallow grave as soon as there was a chance, to be reclaimed later like left luggage. He remembered the hasty service held for others on the small plane a few days before. He didn't panic. Panic would do no good. He prayed, "Father, thy will be done. Thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven." He could feel, he could hear, he could smell. He just couldn't move. A deeper darkness enveloped his eyes, and he became marginally warmer. He could still hear the cacophony of battle all around him. He could still feel the ground shaking from the constant air attacks on the Chinese and the never-ending artillery fire from the People's Volunteer Army on the UN positions. Then he must have lost consciousness again, because he became aware once more the noise of battle was distant. He opened his eyes. He thought he opened his eyes, but the blackness was so complete he wasn't sure. Then he tried moving. First his fingers, they responded. Then his toes, they did too. He took inventory of his limbs, and everything seemed to be there. Then he tried to move. There was a weight holding him down. His head hurt, but that didn't stop him. He felt around and recognized the smell and feel of his poncho. He was wrapped in his poncho, ready for burial. Only he wasn't ready. The shock and fear gave Mark new energy, and he began to push and lift his way out of wherever he was. It took what seemed like hours, but was really only a few minutes. He freed himself from a small mound of bodies already beginning to freeze in the cold around him. He was alone, and the sound of battle was distant. He was behind the Chinese lines with his Marines miles away. He called quietly to the heap of bodies he had climbed out of, just to make sure none others were alive. But there was no response. He even shook a few just to make sure. He wanted to take a look, but he was afraid he would recognize someone, and he didn't want that right now. He heaved his own blood-stained poncho from the heap and struggled into its clammy embrace. It would block the wind. He crouched low to the ground and began to make his way downhill as he remembered his survival training from Paris Island, and wished not for the last time that he could have brought some of the warmth with him as well. Now he was alone, weaponless, and desperate to get back to his unit. with any unit, they were south, with safety, in the Sea of Japan. Keeping low, he headed downhill toward the small river that ran through the bottom of the next valley. The contrast of snow and trees made every outcropping a Chinese unit, every boulder an imaginary Russian tank. Mark had not gone far when he came across the frozen bodies of several Chinese soldiers. They looked so small in death. Young, no older than he. A couple obviously younger. Their eyes open and glazed, frozen, the frost turning their skin to marble. One had an obsolete Russian rifle. Mark eased it out of the cold fingers. He searched for bullets and found a few in each soldier's bag that the Chinese used instead of a backpack. Better than nothing. He bowed and said a silent prayer over the bodies of his enemy. In death, his enemy no more. When he stood, his head began to swim, and his world began to tilt uncontrollably. Vertigo. Maybe he wasn't as healthy as he thought. The moment passed, and the young Marine carefully made his way to the tree line, where there would be a modicum of shelter from the wind and cover from the Chinese. He stepped carefully, moving slowly. He didn't want to break his leg or step in a shell hole. He also wanted to move as quietly as possible in case there were any enemy patrols around. He picked his way through the snow and frozen bracken, occasionally slipping in the treacherous footing of the mountain scree and the shell holes left by the bombardment. He had several episodes of vertigo on his journey. Most of the trees were shattered from the artillery blasts. The gasoline odor of napalm mixed with the smell of wood. There was a greasiness to the air that made Mark glad he still had his nose and mouth covered. By nightfall, he had made it to the bottom of the valley. A frozen river cut the basin in two with a narrow, open channel of flowing water, flowing to the sea. That's where he was headed. Mark's thirst tempted him to risk the thin ice of the channel, but he knew better than to trust it. If the vertigo hit that close to the water, he could end up in the river. He would just have to wait. He gathered his poncho tighter about him and turned to what he hoped was east and south. Darkness fell, but Mark could still hear the water flowing in the narrow channel. The moon wasn't up yet. Mark wasn't sure it was coming up. Such knowledge had left him somewhere along the battlefield, along with the day and the date. But with the snow, he could at least see the black ribbon of water to his right, and he knew he must keep it there. He found the way easiest between the edge of the wood and the rocks and boulders at the edge of the river. Perhaps it was a trade path the Koreans used. He had often seen them walking along the riverbank with massive packs on their backs. Ancient peddlers, backs bowed with the weight of their goods. He must resemble one of them now, with his poncho and his helmet, the rifle slung over his shoulder under the poncho. His mind turned again to Sang He, now that no one was actively trying to kill him. It kept his mind off his empty stomach and growing thirst. He found a piece of driftwood under the snowy bank. He knocked it off the snow and began to use it as a staff. Now he really looked like a peddler. For the first time in a long while, Mark smiled, his dry lips nearly cracking with the unaccustomed movement. And he began to sing in Korean the first song he ever learned. 예수 사랑하심은 거룩하신 마리세 우리들 함약하나 예수 권세 만두다 날 사랑하심 날 사랑하심 날 사랑하심 Jesus loves me. This I know, for the Bible tells me so. Little ones to him belong. They are weak, but he is strong. Jesus loves me. Jesus loves me. Jesus loves me. The Bible tells me so. Sang He was gathering her meager belongings back in her bag when she heard the song floating through the opening of her cave. She waddled to the entrance, bent down and looked out toward the sound. It was a peddler, singing a song from her childhood, the first song she had ever learned in English. In the snow-lit gloom she could see the figure walking by the river she had been following the last few days. The old peddler did not seem to hear her as she squeezed her cumbersome body from the cave mouth. "Samchong, uncle!" Sang-He called in an intense whisper. The figure stopped and slowly turned toward her voice. "Uncle, may I travel with you? I am a poor woman alone with a child." Then the old man dropped to his knees and grabbed his head. Mark had stopped his singing the moment he heard the voice, but the sudden movement of turning his head brought on another bout of vertigo. He fell to his knees in the snow and grabbed his head beneath his helmet to keep it from spinning. With his world roiling and whirling, he hardly knew if the figure was real. She appeared as if by magic, and he wondered if he was hallucinating from hunger or head injury. "Dong-Sang, younger sister, are you real?" "Yes, Samchon, I am real," came the whispered answer. When he dropped down, she had run to him. Mark felt her mittened hands over his own. She spoke very softly, as if to a child. "But by your song, I think we are in the same family, the Yesu family." His head was down, and she could not see his face. "I see you are great with child, Dong-Sang. How may I help you?" "I go to the coast, Samchong, to escape the communists," Sang-He said trustingly. No one who sang "Jesus loves me," as this man had done, would turn her in. At worst, he would not wish to travel so far. "I too wish to go to the coast, Dong-Sang, so perhaps we may walk together. But you may not wish to walk with me when you know that I am a soldier from America, that I do not know the way to the sea, and I have a head wound, so I may not last the trip. My vision swims and spins. My people thought I was dead, and the battle swept by me." Sang-He's mind raced. Not an old man, not a peddler, a soldier, but still a soldier who spoke very good Korean and who sang "Jesus loves me." This man will not hurt me, no matter what propaganda from the north has said. "I will travel with you and show you the way." "Perhaps, then, you should call me Opa, elder brother, since I am not your uncle." Mark said this with a smile in his voice. His head was clearing, and he used the staff to rise to his feet. He was just a little taller than the woman. Of all the things he imagined or expected since he had decided to try to rejoin his unit, finding a young pregnant Korean woman in the night wasn't one of them. Sang-He took in his poncho, his boots, what she could see of his filthy uniform, and the helmet under the hood. She knew enough to recognize the barrel of a rifle making the strange tenting in his poncho. His face was hidden by a rough beard, and his voice hoarse with cold and thirst. "Would you take some water, Opa?" "Yes, Dong-Sang, that would be nice." Sang-He offered him a drink from her water bottle with the flip stopper held by the wire. "Just a sip, Opa." She lifted the bottle gently to his lips and held it while he drank. 1 swallow, 2 swallows, 3 swallows. Then he stopped. "Ah, younger sister, truly you have given me a cup of cold water in the name of the Lord. Gamshahada, thank you. Opa, would you like something to eat? I have a few geran babang. They are not hot as they should be, but it is good food for you." "Dong-Sang, I would love such a treasure as egg bread, but I fear I should not eat at present because of the injury to my head." "Ah, yes, I see that. Should we perhaps proceed on our journey, elder brother?" "Yes, Dong-Sang, let us proceed." They began to walk very slowly in the narrow path between the wood and the river, surrounded by the deep valley blanketed in snow. Hour after hour they walked, stopping for a brief rest as needed throughout the night. When the leaden sky began to lighten with the coming dawn, they slowed down and began to look for some place to spend the day out of sight. The wood offered the only shelter. They found a place slightly up the hillside where the trees were thickest. Mark took off his poncho and spread it on the ground. He helped Sang-He get seated. And then, with his K-bar knife, he began to carefully select evergreen branches for his shelter and a hide to conceal them for the day. When he was finished and they had a place of concealment, Mark took one last branch and swept it over the area to cover his tracks. It would have to do. They would remain here for the few hours of winter daylight until the early darkness would let them travel invisibly again. Sang-He turned her back to him and left a place on the poncho for him to lie down. Mark pulled it over them, and after an arduous travel of the night, they both slept, each sharing their warmth. They woke to the sound of voices. Chinese voices. Mark eased himself up and looked out through the branches of their hide toward the river. In the moonlight, he could see there were 4 Chinese soldiers moving slowly in their threadbare uniforms toward the open channel of the stream. The dark uniforms contrasted with the snow on the ground. Deserters, Mark thought, looking for water. Only one of them had a weapon, and it looked as if he was in charge. He pointed with the rifle at the other 3, who had what could only be scavenged American canteens in their hands. He gestured down with the flat of his hand, and slowly the 3 others got down on their bellies and began to crawl on their elbows through the crusted snow toward the open channel. As the first soldier neared the edge of the ice, Mark heard the crack echo in the glen. A cacophony of Chinese went up from the other 2 as a plea came to the man out on the thin ice. The ice under the man gave way, and he sank into the frigid water. By now, Sang-He was observing with Mark. She gasped as the man went under. They both watched helplessly as the man floundered in the moving water, frantically trying to get a hold of the icy surface. The 2 others, on their bellies, flattened out and tried to ease out to him, but the ice must have begun to crack beneath them because they stopped. The one looked back at the leader and said something, and Mark saw him shake his head. The man in the water stopped struggling as the cold took over his body, and he slipped silently beneath the surface of the river. The 2 men on their bellies began to ease back toward the shore, but a shout from the man standing stopped them. He raised the rifle and pointed again to the water and the canteens in their hands, and then he stood with the rifle crossed menacingly in his arms. After a moment there was a brief exchange between the 2 men. Slowly one eased behind the other and moved in single file ahead toward the newly made edge of broken ice. With an unsteady grip, the lead man reached out to fill the canteen, but as the lip touched the water, the swift current swept the canteen from his hand. He looked back to his friend, who carefully handed him his canteen. Every move was deliberate, careful. The second man eased forward and took the lead soldier by the ankles as he reached out again to fill the canteen. This time he held the canteen with both hands. Mark could only imagine the pain the freezing water must have inflicted on those bare hands. Eventually the canteen was filled, and now he swept his arm back to the second man to give him the canteen. He took it and placed it deftly on the ice, and he looked back and said something to the man standing with the rifle, gesturing slowly with his arm for him to come out and help them. Once again the man shook his head, and then he tossed another American canteen onto the ice. The aluminum ding carried over the distance. He shook his head as it landed halfway between him and the men at the water's edge. Finally, he began to move warily toward it until it was within reach. He kicked it, sliding toward the 2 men, lost his balance, and fell, cracking the ice as he went down heavily. Instantly, he was up on his knees, scrambling back to shore, but too late. The ice began to give way under his frantic clawing. His feet and legs were in the water, and the current underneath the surface of the ice was pulling him down. Gradually, he was pulled under. The inescapable cold took him, leaving only a well of blackness in the ice. Now the 2 men on their bellies were afraid to move. Mark began to rise. Sang-He grabbed his arm. "What are you doing?" "I'm going to help them. They will die soon on the ice. They are our enemy. They are men in need of help." With that, he came slowly out of the tree line. With his knife, he began to cut larger branches of evergreen. There were 2 small saplings that took some time to uproot in his weakened condition, but he freed them from the ground. He made his way out onto the ice with the 2 terrified Chinese soldiers watching his every move. First he scattered the branches over the ice ahead of him as he eased toward them. He had pulled out the waist tie in his poncho, and he began whipping the 2 saplings together. He knelt down and fed the trees out toward the 2 men. He motioned with his hand for the man closest to him to turn sideways so he could grab the sapling in one hand and his partner's leg in the other. By now they were both weak with the cold and from holding so still for so long, but desperation drove them. The soldier nodded, and Mark began to pull. He felt himself slipping, and so he tried to dig his boot heels in deeper ahead of him. He wasn't going to be strong enough to pull both men across the ice, and he wasn't sure they could pull themselves. Then he felt arms around him. As Sang-He lowered herself onto the ice and wrapped her arms around him. This time, when he pulled, he didn't slip. Slowly, painfully, the men began to come across the ice. With every pull, they could hear the ice crack beneath them, but eventually the men were able to pull themselves back to the solid ground of the sapling lifeline with Mark and Sang-He anchoring them. When they finally reached the land, everyone was exhausted. Mark had whispered back to Sang-He to hold him as his head began to spin once more. The 2 Chinese soldiers were weak with fatigue and malnutrition. Their thin uniforms barely kept out the cold. They rolled onto their knees, and when they could, they both bowed to Mark and Sang-He and said, "Shei, thank you." And they took the canteen and offered it to Mark. He took a sip and handed it to Sang-He, who also drank. She gave it back to Mark, and he presented it to the first soldier. "Shei," he said again, took a ceremonial drink, as did his fellow soldier. Then they made another low bow, got to their feet, and began to walk back into the woods away from the frozen river and Mark and Sang-He. They disappeared in the darkness. Soon even the sound of their footsteps died away in the distance. Mark and Sang-He stood, brushed off the snow, and struggled back to their nest to gather up what little they possessed. "Why did you do that?" Sang-He asked. "Why did you risk your life to save those men? Why not let them die? Certainly the one with a rifle would have killed us both and not blinked." I've killed in battle. I've seen enough killing to last several lifetimes, and doubtless when I reach my unit, I will kill again. The only battle they were fighting at the moment was for their lives, and I thought I would help them. Scripture tells us to love our enemies, to do good to those who would despitefully use us. I had to help them. And I had to help you. But you are right. I see that. What should we do? Let's walk in what's left of the night and find another place to hide before dawn. As long as we can follow the river, we will not go wrong. But you know better than I what may be between us and the sea. About 125,000 Chinese soldiers are out there somewhere. Hopefully they will not need to be rescued, Sang-He said, smiling. Hopefully, Mark answered, and they set out. They walked throughout the night. They said little between themselves. It took all their concentration to keep going through the deep snow and bitter cold. Again they found a place to hide in the tree line, and Mark prepared another nest. The vertigo would come and go. They would stop until it cleared. Sang-He also would have to stop and rest because of her pregnancy. They made slow progress, but each step brought them closer to the sea. During these first 2 days, their conversation had been carried out in very polite, very formal Korean. Conversation of 2 strangers of high social standing who had met on a train, each addressing the other as elder brother or younger sister. Mark's Korean had come back to him once he had arrived in the country of his childhood, and Sang-He's diplomatic experience as the wife of a prominent citizen had stood her in good stead. There was a polite word or phrase for every situation. Even in close proximity, there was a well-mannered distance. On the 4th night together, after Mark had pulled the oily-smelling poncho over them, Sang-He ventured, I cannot continue to address you as sir, or American, or soldier, or even elder brother. Please, may I know your name? PFC, Private First Class Mark Grolman at your service, ma'am. Sang-He brought her hands to her mouth to silence her own voice. After that, she became rigidly still. Ma'am, are you all right? Is your baby coming? Was she having a seizure? What was going on? He thought to himself. In a quavering voice, Sang-He asked, Were your parents missionaries here? Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am, they were. They're back in the States now. Do you remember a girl named Sang-He? Yes, ma'am. She was my first love, and I've been looking for her since I came back to Korea. PFC Mark Grolman? You have found Sang-He. Now it was his turn to grow rigidly silent. Mark Yobo, I am your Seng-He. Now Mark's mind was reeling as well as his head. Seng-He was here beside him. Seng-He was married. Seng-He was pregnant. Seng-He. Seng-He who had given him water. Seng-He who had taught him Korean. Seng-He, his first love. Seng-He who he still loved. Seng-He who called him Yobo, which meant the one. He was her Mark Yobo. She would call no one else by that name. Slowly, deliberately they turned, and in the close and secret darkness they shared their stories, their lives, their sorrows, their selves, and found again the love they had when they were 11 and 12 so long ago in 1941, when a world at war had dragged them apart, and now another war had brought them again together. Fatigue caught them, and they slept the rest of the day away. When darkness came, they set out again, hand in hand this time, and no longer distant. The travel was hard and slow. Each step was an effort. The egg bread was a distant memory, but they had water, and they had each other. They saw no one in the night journeys. After a week of travel, they had reached the village of Sangthong. Mark kept in hiding while Seng-He went in search of food and help. Because of her condition, an old woman took pity on her and gave her food, and she brought back the food, and they made a simple meal. They could not light a fire for warmth, or light, or cooking, but they huddled together. They kept the cold away. Another few days found them in the next village south, Singsangri, where again Seng-He received help, and the news that the Americans had passed through with the Chinese army close on their heels. All around them they could see the signs of the battle, burned-out trucks, shell holes, the dead stripped of anything useful to the People's Volunteer Army. Now Mark began to realize he would never catch up with the UN forces or his old unit. It began to weigh on his mind. How would they get past the Chinese? How would they find help to get Seng-He to safety? His vertigo became more constant and pronounced. It slowed their already glacial progress. But Seng-He was strong enough for both of them. They came to Sengzongri and then Sengchengri, and finally to the outskirts of Yonghuang, just north of the final rallying point of the UN forces. This much Mark had remembered. If they did not catch them there, they would never catch them. By now it was nearly Christmas, and the Chinese army was still between them and their final destination of Hungnam, on the Sea of Japan. Seng-He had gotten back from Yonghuang with some food when Mark lost consciousness. She tried to bring him back around. Either his body had shut down from trying to deal with the vertigo, or his head injury had been more severe than either of them had thought. Whatever the reason, she could not leave him. She could not believe that God had brought them together again just to separate them now. She bowed her head and began to pray. Eternal Father, we are your children. We need help. My friend, my love, Mark, needs your help. I need your help. We are trying to reach safety. We have gone as far as we can go. We have come to the end of ourselves, our strength, our knowledge. Please, Eternal Father, help us. She laid her head on Mark's chest and covered them with a ragged poncho, and slept the sleep of one whose strength is gone. After a time she woke, and made her way to the river that ran from town to town and to the sea. Tied to the shore, trapped in the frozen rime of ice that stretched between the land and the narrow channel kept open by the flow of the river, was a small boat, the sturdy rowing boats used by the local fishermen. If she could get it free, then perhaps they could use it to float to Hungnam. She untied the boat. She tried to pull it ashore, but it was frozen fast. She kept hold of the rope and stepped onto the ice surrounding the little dinghy. She felt it cracking as she placed her pregnant weight on the ice with each tentative step. Step, crack, step, crack. Finally she reached the boat. As she made to step in, her foot went through the ice. Her leg sank nearly to her knee, but no deeper. The cold was intense. It took her breath away. She had a fleeting pain for the Chinese soldier as they'd watched drown 2 weeks ago. Silently, she flung her free leg into the open boat and rolled herself on board, drawing her dripping foot and skirt after her. Her weight in the boat broke it free from the binding ice, and she felt it float, rocking gently in its mooring of ice. This time, she put her wet foot over the other side of the rowboat and eased her weight delicately down, as delicately as a woman who is 9 months pregnant can do, until she felt the ice underfoot. Then she began to stand. On this side the ice held her, and she got out of the boat and began to haul it across the ice toward the shore. She went to Mark and wrapped the bedraggled poncho around his insensible body and began to pull him toward the grounded boat. She rolled him onto it like so much baggage, and once again took the rope in her hands and strained to pull it back to the water. She pulled as far as she dared lest she break through the ice again, and then skidded her way back to the back of the tender. This time she pushed with all her might as the boat began to slip slowly over the frozen surface. It was half in the water when she realized that at some point she needed to be in the boat with Mark. She looked down at her still sopping foot, now beginning to freeze in the Arctic air. She took several deep breaths to steady herself for the shock, gave one galvanic shove, and leaped into the tiny boat as it floated free of the ice and out into the stream. She spread the poncho over them and hoped that the December darkness would do the rest. Slowly they gathered momentum in the narrow channel of the river and passed silently into the night, past the guard posts and sentries, rocks and sandbars, flotsam and jetsam, until the boat came to rest at a spit of ice past the People's Volunteer Army and inside the United Nations line of defense. Shortly after saying he had gotten Mark from the rowboat and safely on shore, she thought the Chinese had renewed their attack and all was lost. Explosions began to go off all around them. Houses were set on fire. There were UN and Korean soldiers going from house to house, clearing out the residents so the houses could be blown up to prevent them from being used by the Chinese. Everywhere she looked, the sky was red with war. Explosions threw debris high into the air. Flames licked up to touch the sky. The noise of the explosion mixed with the roar of the flames and the fear-filled cries of the people trying to escape the coming army. She could hear the chatter of gunfire, the whine of mortars flying overhead. There were people with bags of rice on their heads, people with luggage clutched in their arms, desperation on every face. The streets were like a river of people, all moving slowly toward the waterfront and escape. While the chaos of the crowds made it hard to move, it also made it easy for them to go unnoticed. The rest had done Mark some good. While he wasn't completely back, he was at least mobile and would go wherever Sang He told him. She was able to trade his U.S.-made army boots for Korean clothing. She got him to put these on in a back alley and began bandaging his face as a disguise. He shuffled along in her wake, holding her hand with his right and his swirling head with his left. Delirium was overtaking him, and he would shout out in Korean memories from the past. The first time he did this, Sang He tried to hush him, but then she realized nothing would convince people more that her yobo was Korean than shouting in Korean. In fact, pretty much everyone was shouting in Korean, what sounded like the ravings of the mad in the detached snatches Sang He heard as they swam their way to the waterfront. She felt like they had descended into Bedlam. Captain Leonard LaRue stood on the deck overlooking his ship, the SS Meredith Victory, named for a small Baptist girls' college in North Carolina. This cargo vessel hardly seemed the stuff of victory, but they were mighty, those Baptists. He had traveled to the school during one of his brief trips ashore after the war, mostly out of curiosity. Why had the powers that be named his ship, when she was built in 1945 at the end of World War II, for a Baptist girls' school? He had no idea. He hoped that the Meredith angels were watching over her during the beginning of this war, as they had over the end of the last one. He remembered the words he had read in the college bulletin while waiting for a tour. It was from the Bible. Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue, if there be any praise, think on these things. Philippians 4:8, he remembered. Whatever that meant. He had no idea there were Filipinos in the Bible, but he liked what he'd read. Think on the things that were good. He looked at his decks crowded with supplies and equipment. and imagined the decks filled with people. He had heard the reports. China had joined the war. The UN forces were being overrun. With that happening, the people fleeing to the south would be caught in the middle. But what could he do? His ship was so small and the people were so many. He thought he could rescue a few hundred, maybe, 1,000 if they squeezed on. As soon as he could, he docked at the quayside and began to unload. He had told his first mate and everyone else on the ship that if it wasn't necessary to the operation of the ship, it had to go. The only thing that had to stay was the 450 barrels of jet fuel in the hold. They would just have to pack people around him. It was December 21st, and he knew time was running out. His crew took him at his word and began unloading everything until the ship rode higher in the water than she had when she was commissioned 5 years ago. On the afternoon of December 22nd, he started boarding those now calm, stoic Koreans who were about to lose everything. Young, old, families, husbands and wives, pregnant women, numerous sick and injured boarded his ship throughout the night. Some climbed cargo netting to come aboard. Others made their way up the ramp built by the Army Corps of Engineers to access the ship docked nose out for a faster getaway. After a few thousand, his men just stopped counting and let them find a place for themselves wherever they could. They filled the 5 cargo holds and every inch of space on the main deck. Captain LaRue smiled when he remembered his ship was made to carry 12 passengers. Sang He guided Mark to the boarding ramp of the SS Meredith Victory. Out of the dozens upon dozens of ships taking evacuees on board, she had picked this one. The last one. Mark was still docile between bouts of delirium, and they went on board quietly. Shuffling ahead, down onto the deck of the ship, they pressed themselves against the portside railing. Sang He looked at the faces around her. No one was smiling, but no one was crying. Everyone was quiet, respectful. The people continued to flood on, filling every open space on the ship. The ship got lower and lower in the water until finally it could truly hold no more. Everywhere Sang He looked, there were people. She had no idea how many cargo holds had swallowed, but she thought there must be thousands. It took 26 hours from start to finish. She learned later that 14,000 Korean men, women, and children were on board. She turned inward toward Mark. She reached up and took his face in her hands. She saw people look away out of the corner of her eye. Touching was not done, not in public in Korea. But after all they had been through, she wanted to look into his eyes. She wanted him to know they were together. The order was given to cast off, and the ship shuddered as the diesel engines began to churn the water of the quayside as the big ship moved off out into the open sea of Japan. It was as if some enormous sea creature had begun swimming out to sea. The deck thrummed with the engine noise. There was a rhythmic pulse that went through the ship as the enormous propellers turned over and over. There was no cheer that went up from smiling lips. There was only silence and the sounds of the working of the ship. As they got safely away from the harbor along with the other ships filled with refugees, there came an ear-shattering boom as the big guns from the U.S. battleships began to rain down destruction on the city and the advancing army beyond. Nothing was to be left for the invaders. The harbor had been mined by the Navy frogmen. Sappers had placed explosives throughout the waterfront. Dark clouds of smoke rose higher and higher as the 16-inch shells found their mark and the explosives began to be set off. The air shook with the energy of the blast. She could see above the deck a pillar of black smoke 20 stories high that rose over the destruction of the city. They were away, heading through the most heavily mined harbor in Korea with no detection equipment except the eyes of the crew. They had no escort ships, no defense on board, and 450 miles to go before they reached Busan in safety. As they reached the open ocean, the swells grew larger, taking the ship up the side of one wave and down the next. The cold descended with the going down of the sun, and even in the crowded conditions, the icy fingers found their way into the very bones of a person. After a time, there was food served from the galley, but the meager ship's stores were no match for the numbers of people, and yet nearly everyone had something. It had been so long since Mark and Sang He had eaten, even a mouthful was heavenly. Perhaps one of those bags of rice had found its way on board. Fresh water was passed around, and again everyone had something. The diesel engines droned on relentlessly, taking them ever closer to their destination. Mile after mile they went with the bow cutting through the waves of the gray-green sea. The cold sea spray splashed up at the bow. The moon rose and colored everything and everyone silver with its light. Up on the bridge of the ship, Sang-He could see the glow of the binnacle on the faces of the captain and crew. Her legs grew used to the motion of the ship, and she must have fallen asleep on her feet because she felt Mark catch her in his arms, the first sign that he was back in the land of the conscious. She looked up at him and saw the light in his eyes and the smile curl on his lips as he held her a little closer, at least as close as one can hold a pregnant woman at 9 months. "What day is today?" asked Mark quietly in English. "It is Sunday, my Mark." "What is the date?" "It is Christmas Eve, my love," Sang-He whispered. "Christmas Eve, and I am with a woman who is carrying a child which is not my own, but who I will raise as my own if you will let me. If only my name were Joseph. Where have I heard of that happening before?" "Are you asking me to marry you, Mark Yobo?" "I am. And what do you say?" "I say, I will." "Mark Yobo?" "Yes." "I think the baby is coming." "Well, of course the baby's coming. You're pregnant." "No, I think the baby is coming now." Mark lifted Sang-He in his arms and began to move toward the bulkhead that led to the lower deck. In English, he began shouting, "Medic! Medic! Need a medic here!" "Not another one," said First Mate D.S. Sevastio. "This is the 4th one this voyage, and we're coming into Pusan Harbor. Come on!" The three made their way down into the ship's infirmary, where there were already 3 other new mothers with newborns in their arms. They stood and moved to the doorway as Sang-He held her belly and groaned. "Stand out there with them. I got this." "Do you know what you're doing?" "I've had first aid training, and like I said, this is my 4th this voyage. I just catch 'em. Mama-san here does all the work. Outside." It did not take long for the baby to come. That was a good thing in Sang-He's weakened condition. In a very short time, Mark heard the words, "You can come in now. You the father?" "I will be." Sevastio gave him a strange look and shook his head. Mark came in and embraced Sang-He. She had never looked more beautiful to him. She smiled weakly and shifted on the cot with the baby in her arms. She kissed the baby on his forehead and held him out for Mark to hold. Mark looked at his filthy hands and his tattered clothes and shook his head. "Please, it is all right. A little dirt won't hurt him. I want him to know you. I want him to know me too." Mark reached out for the tiny bundle. "And they found the babe wrapped in swaddling clothes and lying in a manger," Mark quoted. "What will you call him?" "Well, not Jesus," Sang-He smiled. "I have thought of it. We escaped from the north. We are in Pusan Harbor in the south. I remember something from a Bible lesson we shared long ago. I thought Benjamin, son of the south, would be good. Merry Christmas, Mark Yobo." "Merry Christmas," Sang-He, my love. "A Christmas that will never be forgotten." It took 2 more days for the ship to reach Koji Island to disembark the 14,000 passengers. Landing craft had to pull alongside, and the people were lifted on large pallets down onto the craft over and over until the ship was again empty. Mark and Sang-He made what plans they could to be married. Mark would have to report for duty and be checked out by the Marine doctors at the military hospital, but then he would start the process of permission to marry Sang-He. It was not as hard as the journey they had already faced together, but infinitely more complicated as far as the Marines were concerned. But Mark wanted to bring his bride back home to Toledo and live happily ever after. The end. Merry Christmas from the Whitleys. For my friends, Mark and Susan. For Christina. For Rich. And for Mary Ann. The events of the Chosin Reservoir are true. In November of 1950, 125,000 Communist Chinese troops attacked nearly 25,000 combined American, British, Canadian, and Turkish forces fighting under the UN banner. The battle raged over 53 miles of a 1-lane road as the UN troops, some Army, some Marine, some British Commando, fought to fight their way to the evacuation point from November 25th to December 21st. A Life magazine photographer did snap a picture of a young Marine and asked him what he wanted for Christmas. "Another tomorrow," was his reply. On the UN side, there were approximately 5,000 casualties. On the Chinese Communist side, there were an estimated 60,000 casualties, mostly from the extreme cold. In the end, the UN forces evacuated 100,000 military and civilian personnel, and 98,000 Korean civilians in the largest sea evacuation in history, using 194 ships, cargo vessels, landing craft, and small craft that began December 21st and finished December 26, 1950. The SS Meredith Victory was the last ship out of the harbor, carrying 14,000 Koreans. 5 babies were born on board during the 3-day voyage from Hungnam to Busan and eventually landing at Koji Island, where there is a memorial to the event today. Captain Leonard LaRue said after the voyage that he felt the hand of God over his vessel during the journey. Not a single passenger or crewman was lost. 5 medals of honor were awarded for this battle. The Korean conflict is known as the Forgotten War, but it is my hope that the valor of the humanitarian effort to rescue so many under such danger will never be forgotten. And yes, it was inevitable that those that fought in the battle were called the Frozen Chosen. Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas.